On April 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison, the nation's ninth president, breathed his last. He said to his doctor, "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." His death would have extreme consequences, causing at least the collapse of a major political party, but possibly affecting two of America's wars. But the story that most of us learned about why he died is almost certainly false. In fact, he may have been the victim of a serial killer of U.S. presidents, the Water in Washington, D.C. William Henry Harrison's victory in the election of 1840 was closer in the popular vote than in the Electoral College. The Whig received 234 Electoral College votes to just 60 for Democrat incumbent Martin Van Buren. Harrison, a war hero known for his victory in battle in November 1811 over tribal forces near the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash Rivers in Tecumseh's War, famously ran on the slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too." Harrison had also run as a populist, portraying Martin Van Buren as an elitist. An odd comparison, since Harrison came from the prominent Harrison family of Virginia, the closest thing to aristocracy in America. Public dissatisfaction following the market crash of 1837 carried Harrison to victory, although the vote margin was only around 150,000. From there, you have probably heard the story. On March 4th, Harrison stood in what was described as bitterly cold and wet weather, some 48 degrees Fahrenheit, and delivered the longest inaugural address in U.S. presidential history, 8,445 words, speaking for nearly 2 hours. Wary of appearance, the 68-year-old Harrison, the oldest man to have been elected to the office at the time, refused to wear a coat, hat, or gloves. He then attended 3 inaugural balls, possibly wearing the same wet clothes in which he had delivered the speech. As a result of the exposure, he developed a cold, which then became pneumonia, the official cause of his death listed by his doctor, Thomas Miller, on April 4th, exactly 31 days after his inauguration. So for many, many years, the New York Times wrote in 2014, the story persisted that Harrison was literally killed by his own inaugural speech in 1841, after which he developed pneumonia. His condition was aggravated by his age. The last president to have been born a British subject, the first to arrive in Washington for his inauguration on a train, became the first president to die in office, and the president who served for the shortest period, killed by his own long-winded speech. His death would have significant ramifications at the time, particularly for the Whig Party. It all seems an absurd result of the mere vanity of not wanting to be seen wearing a coat. But that story, long accepted and taught in schools, had issues from the start. The first person who seemed unsure was Dr. Miller himself, who wrote, "The disease was not viewed as a case of pure pneumonia. But as this was the most palpable affection, the term pneumonia afforded a succinct and intelligible answer to the innumerable questions as to the nature of the attack." It was Miller's description of that atypical pneumonia that led doctors Jane McHugh and Philip McCoyac to question what really happened to General Harrison in a 2014 edition of the journal Clinical Infectious Disease. They write, "In nearly 2 centuries since Harrison's death, Miller's diagnosis has not been challenged. Biographies, history books, and periodicals have consistently maintained that pneumonia was the disorder that carried off America's 9th president just 31 days after having been sworn into office. But," the New York Times wrote in 2014, "Harrison summoned Miller to the White House on March 26, complaining not of a lung ailment, but of anxiety and fatigue." McHugh and McCoyac note, although the president had fever, dyspnea, and cough productive of blood-tinged sputum during the course of his illness, his pulmonary symptoms didn't arise until the 5th day of his illness and were intermittent rather than progressive thereafter. His gastrointestinal complaints, by comparison, began on the 3rd day of his illness and were relentless as well as progressive. Their conclusion, given the dominance of Harrison's gastrointestinal signs and symptoms, it is more likely that he died of gastrointestinal infection, in particular enteric fever, with secondary involvement of the lungs, than of pulmonary infection. All of Harrison's signs and symptoms, in fact, were typical of enteric fever. This shows at the end of Miller's report, describing the president's death. Finally, on the 3rd of April at 3:00 p.m., profuse diarrhea came on, under which he sank at 30 minutes to 1 o'clock in the morning of the 4th. Profuse diarrhea is never a pleasant way to go, but it is also not a symptom of pneumonia. But that, of course, raises another question. If the President Harrison died of enteric fever, how did he contract it? Enteric fever is a severe systemic illness caused by disseminated infection with salmonella. And how would the President of the United States be exposed to this bacteria? McHugh and McCoyak surmise. There is ample reason to conclude that Harrison's move into the White House placed him at particular risk of contracting enteric fever. The fact is, in 1841, the nation's capital was, public radio's global news program The World Explains, quite literally, a cesspool. Author J.D. Dickey, in his 2014 book Empire of Mud, The Secret History of Washington, D.C., wrote, "The areas currently occupied by the World War II Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial were once known as the Potomac Flats, a place that was more septic tank than national point of pride. And the White House was at particular risk." Mike Darrow of the Florida Water and Pollution Control Operators Association explains. The first water system for the city of Washington, near the White House, was created in 1802 at a natural spring. In 1808, a well was sunk at the spring site and expanded the system to a few nearby hotels. The U.S. Congress first appropriated funds in 1819 to purchase the spring and supply for a dedicated water source to the president's house, but this was not completed until 1833. With the addition of steam-driven pumps and cast-iron piping, the spring water was delivered to the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. Water was supplied this way until the early 1850s, when the water sources were changed. But there was a problem with the president's well. McHugh and McCoyak write. In 1841, the nation's capital had no sewer system. Until 1850, sewage from nearby buildings simply flowed onto public grounds a short distance from the White House, where it stagnated and formed a marsh. Darrow continues, this dump was a ground depression opening used to get rid of waste, which was upstream of the natural flow of the groundwater to the White House's source water. This sewage dump was used by locals and government to dump nightly waste, an early process for disposing of wastewater. Never a good thing to be downstream of that. This method of disposal of human waste with no treatment would have been a breeding ground for two deadly bacteria, Salmonella typhi and Salmonella paratyphi. And so if there is poetic justice in a politician being killed by his own long-winded speech, isn't there also poetic justice in a politician being killed by the toxic stink of the nation's political center? And to be fair, there is some evidence that being out in the cold can reduce your resistance to infection, especially if you happen to be an older gentleman like President Harrison was. So possibly his long-winded speech did contribute to his being killed by the toxic stink of the nation's capital and its untreated poo. Perhaps as distressingly, Dr. Harris may have contributed to his patient's death. The New York Times explains at least Miller did not bleed the president, but he gave him a host of toxic medications that were considered the standard of care, including opium, which retards the intestine's ability to rid itself of microbial pathogens, facilitating their invasion into the bloodstream. Enemas, which Miller repeatedly gave to Harrison, are also potentially dangerous in such patients. They can perforate ulcers produced by S. typhi and S. paratyphi in the ileum, the lower end of the small intestine, through which the bacteria would be able to escape from the intestine into the bloodstream, resulting in sepsis. That is, Dr. Miller's treatment may well have facilitated the infection that killed the president. In any case, there was little the doctor could have done. As McHugh and McCoyak note, in 1841 there was no effective treatment for enteric fever. So the president died of explosive diarrhea caused by the stink of the U.S. Capitol. What does that mean? As to the death of Harrison, possibly quite a lot. First, when Harrison died, the Constitution was somewhat unclear about succession. Article 2, Clause 1, Section 6 reads, in case of the removal of the president from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. That left some confusion. Did the powers and duties of the office only devolve to the vice president, or did the office of the president? Was Vice President Taylor the president, or merely the acting president? Tyler asserted that he was the president, a convention that was thereafter called the Tyler precedent. And what did that mean for the nation? Well, it's always a risk to guess what ifs, but Tyler was formerly a maverick Democrat and not nearly as supportive of the Whig platform as Harrison. This would be significant for the party. The Miller Center of the University of Virginia writes, the death of Harrison prevented the congressional Whigs from consolidating power. Within a decade and a half, the party was in pieces, splintered into the existing Democrats and a new party, the Republicans. To some, the death of Harrison was a disaster. Dr. Anthony Kominga of the Institute for Humane Studies wrote in 2019, John Tyler is perhaps an unlikely and even idiosyncratic choice for worst president ever, but I will argue that he, more than anyone else, killed the American tradition of revolutionary republicanism and inaugurated a generation of slaveholder imperialism. In the pursuit of base political self interest, Tyler crushed so much of what made America special that we might say that the election of 1840 was when American exceptionalism faded into the realm of pure myth. Whether Tyler was simply unequal to the task, as former President Adams said of him, a spirit incapable of expansion to the dimensions of the station upon which he had been cast by the hand of Providence, unseen through the apparent agency of choice, no one ever thought of him being placed in the executive chair, there are very practical considerations. McHugh and McKeown note that Harrison would have been unlikely to so aggressively move to annex Texas, which they note precipitated a war with Mexico 2 years later. And following the U.S. victory, passionate disputes erupted between North and South over the expansion of slavery into the vast territories taken from Mexico. They conclude, had Harrison lived to complete his presidency, the Mexican War might have been delayed, and the Civil War pushed forward in time. Quite a lot of consequence caused by the Capitol's stink. But it was just the beginning. James Polk was elected in 1844. He died less than 3 months after leaving office. Darrow notes, James K. Polk, too, reported frequently in his diary that he suffered from stomach and intestinal problems while in the White House. For example, Polk's diary entry for Thursday, June 29, 1848, noted that before sunrise, that morning he was taken with a violent diarrhea, accompanied by severe pain, which rendered him unable to move. Polk, a noted workaholic, spent nearly his entire administration tethered to the White House, and after leaving office, weakened by years of gastric poisoning, Polk succumbed to cholera morbus a mere 3 months after leaving the Oval Office. Cholera is another bacterial gastrointestinal infection. Zachary Taylor, elected in 1848, replaced Polk. Taylor, ironically, had ridden to office largely on fame garnered during the war with Mexico that the death of Harrison may have precipitated. 16 months later, he died. Taylor's death is still somewhat of a mystery, with some of his symptoms being indicative of arsenic poisoning, leading to a theory that he may have been poisoned by his rivals, upset that he was opposed to expansion of slavery in the West. That issue was settled in 2014. As the Louisville Courier-Journal explains, Taylor's remains were disinterred and tested. The results released by Dr. George Nichols, Kentucky's chief medical examiner. He was not poisoned. At least not poisoned by arsenic, but by the stink of the Capitol? Darrow writes, Zachary Taylor also succumbed in July 1850 to what was essentially an acute form of gastroenteritis. The cause was probably Salmonella bacteria. Physician Dr. Gabe Mirakin explained in the Florida Villages News, the perfectly healthy president ate a lot of food on a hot day and then quickly developed diarrhea, vomiting, and fever. Several of his cabinet members who ate the same food at the 4th of July celebration also came down with fever and belly pain. The symptoms had to be caused by an infection. High fever is a hallmark for infection with intestinal bacteria called Salmonella typhosa. The extremely painful belly that hurt so much when doctors touch it was probably caused by a rupture of his intestines that leaked intestinal contents into his belly. He probably died from the food-borne infection that was common in those days called typhoid fever. How significant was the death of Zachary Taylor? The Miller Center of the University of Virginia speculates, more importantly, had he lived, there might not have been a Compromise of 1850 or even the Civil War, because the South was too disunited in 1850 to form a viable secession movement. Taylor's unflinching support, had he lived for the immediate statehood of the Western Territories, might have changed the course of history. Only 3 U.S. presidents were actually elected to that office in the 1840s, and there is compelling reason to believe that all 3 of them might have been killed by the toxic stink of Washington, D.C. Literally death, because they lived in the White House. Politics can be, I guess, dirty business. Although, to be fair, these illnesses and infections would have been common almost anywhere in the United States, certainly any city, and pretty much anywhere in the world. And it wasn't limited just to the 1840s. Thomas Jefferson's diary, for example, mentions that he was frequently afflicted with diarrhea after he moved into the White House. And even though the water source was changed in 1850, the growth of population during the Civil War led to other sanitation issues, which almost certainly caused the death of William Wallace Lincoln at the age of 11. Died of typhus from polluted water. A devastating blow to President and Mrs. Lincoln. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.